Hi, boys and girls. We're going to start a story, one of my favorite stories by Lois Lowry. It's called Gooney Greene. On the back it says, when Gooney Greene makes her grand entrance at the Water Tower Elementary School one October morning, her fellow second graders are immediately intrigued. After all, it's not every day that a new student shows up to Miss Pigeon's classroom wearing pajamas and cowboy boots. Miss Pigeon has been teaching her class about the elements of storytelling, and when story time comes around that day, the choice is unanimous. Everyone wants to hear about Gooney Greene. That suits Gooney just fine, because not only does she enjoy being right smack in the middle of everything, but she also just happens to be a storytelling expert with quite a few interesting tales to tell. All right. So as we read our opening chapter, we're going to meet a character called Kiko. Later, I'll tell you to make up a story about Kiko. You'll have to use your imagination. But notice any details that might help you as I read. Chapter 1. There was a new student at Water Tower Elementary School. She arrived in October after the first month of school had already passed. She opened the second grade classroom door at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning and appeared there all alone, without even a mother to introduce her. She was wearing pajamas and cowboy boots and holding a dictionary and a lunchbox. "Hello, Mrs. Pigeon," the second grade teacher said. "We're in the middle of our spelling lesson." "Good," said the girl in pajamas. "I brought my dictionary. Where's my desk?" "Who are you?" Mrs. Pigeon asked politely. "I'm your new student. My name is Gooney Greene. That's Greene with a silent E at the end, and I just moved here from China. I want a desk right smack in the middle of the room because I like to be right smack in the middle of everything." Now, good readers make connections with their own lives as they read, and it helps them to understand books better. When I read these first pages, I'm wondering what I would say if a student like Gooney Greene showed up at our door and said that. What do you think I would say? All right, so let's look. Here's a quick picture. Here's Miss Gooney Greene holding a dictionary and a lunchbox. The class stared at the new girl with admiration. They had never met anyone like Gooney Greene. She was a good student. She sat down at the desk Mrs. Pigeon provided, right smack in the middle of everything, and began doing second grade spelling. She did all her work neatly and quickly, and she followed instructions. But soon it was clear that Gooney was mysterious and interesting. Her clothes were unusual. Her hairstyles were unusual. Even her lunches were unusual. At lunchtime on Wednesday, her first day in the school, she opened her lunchbox and brought out sushi and a pair of bright green chopsticks. Remember, sushi is uncooked fish. On Thursday, her second day at Water Tower Elementary School, Gooney Greene was wearing a pink ballet tutu over green stretch pants, and she had 3 small red grapes, an avocado, and an oatmeal cookie for lunch. On Thursday afternoon, after lunch, Mrs. Pigeon stood in front of the class with a piece of chalk in her hand. "Today," she said, "we are going to continue talking about stories." "Yay!" the second graders said in very loud voices, all but Felicia Ann, who never spoke, and Malcolm, who wasn't paying attention. He was under his desk as usual. "Gooney you weren't here for the first month of school, but our class has been learning about what makes good stories, haven't we?" Mrs. Pigeon said. Everyone nodded, all but Malcolm, who was under his desk doing something with scissors. "Class, what does a story need most of all? Who remembers?" Mrs. Pigeon had chalk in her hand in the air, ready to write something on the board. The children were silent for a minute. They were thinking. Finally, Chelsea raised her hand. "Chelsea, what does a good story need?" "A book," Chelsea said. Mrs. Pigeon put her chalk hand down. "There are many stories that don't need a book," she said pleasantly. "Aren't there, class? If your grandma tells you a story about when she was a little girl, she doesn't have a story in a book, does she?" The class stared at her, all but Malcolm, who was still under his desk, and Felicia Ann, who always looked at the floor and never raised her hand and never spoke. Beanie said, "My grandma lives in Boston." Kiko said, "My grandma lives in Honolulu." Ben said loudly, "My grandma lives in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania." Tricia shouted, "My grandma is very rich." "Class!" said Mrs. Pigeon. "Shh!" Then in a quieter voice, she explained, "Another time we'll talk about our families. But right now," she stopped talking and looked at Barry Tuckerman. Barry was up on his knees in his seat, and his hand was waving in the air as hard as he could make it wave. "Barry," Mrs. Pigeon said, "do you have something that you simply have to say? Something that cannot possibly wait?" Barry nodded yes. His hand waved. "And what is so important?" Barry stood up beside his desk. Barry Tuckerman liked to make very important speeches, and they always required that he stand. "My grandma," Barry Tuckerman said, "went to jail once. She was 20 years old, and she went to jail for civil disobedience." Then Barry sat down. "The class has definitely gotten off subject, hasn't it? How would you answer Miss Pigeon's question? She asked what a story needs. How would you have answered her? Think about that for a minute." All right. Thank you, Barry. Now, let's look at what I'm writing on the board. Who can read this word? Everyone, all but Malcolm and Felicia Ann, watched as she wrote the long word. Then they shouted it out. "Beginning." "Good," Mrs. Pigeon said. "Now, I'm sure you'll know this one." She wrote again. "Middle," the children shouted. "Good. And can you guess what the last word will be?" She held up her chalk and waited. "End." "Correct," Mrs. Pigeon said. "Good for you, second graders. Those are the parts that a story needs. A beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, I'm going to write another very long word on the board. Let's see what good readers you are." She wrote a C, then an H. "Mrs. Pigeon," someone called. She wrote an A and an R. "Mrs. Pigeon," several children were calling now. She turned to see what was so important. Malcolm was standing beside his desk. He was crying. "Malcolm needs to go to the nurse, Mrs. Pigeon," Beanie said. Mrs. Pigeon went to Malcolm and knelt down beside him. "What's the trouble, Malcolm?" she asked, but he couldn't stop crying. I know," Nicholas said. Nicholas always knew everything, and his desk was beside Malcolm's. "Tell me, Nicholas. Remember Kiko showed us how to make origami stars?" All the second graders reached in their desks and their pockets and their lunch boxes. There were tiny stars everywhere. Kiko had shown them how to make origami stars out of small strips of paper. The stars were very easy to make. The school janitor had complained just last Friday that he was sweeping up hundreds of origami stars. "Malcolm put one in his nose," Nicholas said, "and now he can't get it out." Why do you think Malcolm put one in his nose? Sometimes I don't understand second graders. "Is that correct, Malcolm?" Mrs. Pigeon asked. Malcolm nodded and wiped his eyes. "Don't sniff, Malcolm. Do not sniff. That is an order." She took his hand and walked with him out of the classroom door. She turned to the class. "Children," she said, "I am going to be gone for exactly 1 minute and 30 seconds while I walk with Malcolm to the nurse's office down the hall. Stay in your seats while I'm gone. Think about the word character. A character is what a story needs. When I come back from the nurse's office, we are going to create a story together. You must choose who the main character will be. Talk amongst yourselves quietly. Think about interesting characters like Abraham Lincoln, or perhaps Christopher Columbus, or Babe Ruth," called Ben. "Yes, Babe Ruth is a definite possibility. I'll be right back." Now, just in case you were wondering, Babe Ruth was a very famous baseball player, for those of you that don't know. I wonder who they're going to pick as their character. Mrs. Pigeon left the classroom with Malcolm. When she returned 1 minute and 30 seconds later without Malcolm, the class was waiting. They had been whispering, all but Felicia Ann, who never whispered. "Have you chosen?" she asked. The class nodded. All of their heads went up and down, except for Felicia Ann, because she always looked at the floor. "And your choice is?" All of the children but Felicia Ann called out together. "Gooney Bird Greene," they called. And here's a picture of Malcolm with the star up his nose, and he's going to have to go to see the nurse. Mrs. Pigeon sighed. "Class," she said, "there are many different kinds of stories. There are stories about imaginary creatures like Dumbo," Tricia called out. "Raise your hand if you want to speak, please," Mrs. Pigeon said. "But yes, Tricia, you are correct. Dumbo is an imaginary character. There are also stories about real people from history like Christopher Columbus and... She stopped. Barry Tuckerman was waving and waving his hand. Yes, Barry? Do you have something very important to say? Barry Tuckerman stood up. He twisted the bottom of his shirt around in his fingers. I forget, he said at last. Well, then sit back down, Barry. Now, I thought, class, that since Christopher Columbus's birthday is coming up soon... She looked at Barry Tuckerman, whose hand was waving like a windmill once again. Barry, she said. Barry Tuckerman stood up again. We already know all the stories about Christopher Columbus, he said. We want to hear a true story about Gooney Bird Greene. Yes, Gooney Bird Greene, the class called. Why do you think the class wants to know about Gooney Bird Greene? She's different, remember, so maybe they think there's some interesting stories. Mrs. Pigeon sighed again. I'm afraid I don't know many facts about Gooney Bird Greene, she said. But I know a lot of facts about Christopher Columbus, though. Christopher Columbus was born at... We want Gooney Bird Greene, the class chanted. Gooney Bird, Miss Pigeon said finally. How do you feel about this? Gooney Bird stood up beside her desk in the middle of the room. Can I tell the story, she asked. Can I be right smack in the middle of everything? Can I be the hero? Well, since you would be the main character, Mrs. Pigeon said, I guess that would put you in the middle of everything. I guess that would make you the hero. Good, Gooney Bird said. I will tell you an absolutely true story about me. And that's where we're going to stop for today. And we'll read chapter 2 tomorrow. Thanks for listening.